Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Government to answer a question about the state of child poverty.
Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Secretary Iain Duncan Smith. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, today's the latest low-income statistics, based on the Households Below Average Income report, are published covering April 2013 to March 2014. They show the percentage of individuals and children in relative low income is at its lowest level since the 1980s. The latest figures also show that the proportion of people in both relative and absolute low income remained flat on the year for children, working-age adults and disabled people. For pensioners, a statistical change, but the proportion in relative and absolute low income have increased slightly. The figures I have quoted are measured against RPI, and as the House will know, RPI has become anyway a discredited measurement as CPI is used everywhere else in the world. So I have also taken the liberty of putting into the publication what the statistics authorities have also produced, the effects when measured against CPI as well, a much more widely used figure. And these figures are even more positive than what I consider the other ones to be as well today. I believe that today's figures demonstrate that if you deal with the root causes of poverty, and I believe this government is doing that, then even under a measure of poverty that I have consistently over the last few years described as flawed, you can still have an impact. Let me remind the House of some of the important things that my government has done to help families on low income through tackling root causes. Whether in education, we have introduced the pupil premium and tackled failing schools with the Free Schools programme. Our commitment to supporting families through the groundbreaking Troubled Families programme, which is turning really difficult families around in difficult communities. Our investment in early years support and childcare. Our unprecedented back-to-work programmes that have helped support hundreds of thousands of people once written off back into work. And raising the tax threshold, which means that those on the lowest incomes often do not pay any tax, or if they do, they pay a lower rate of tax and keep more of their own income. And finally, our fundamental belief that the most powerful way to change lives is by creating a welfare system that makes work pay, writes no one off, and supports people into work. This is what we have been doing and what the left has failed to understand, particularly the Labour Party. If you deal with the root causes of poverty, at which work is a critical component, many of the symptoms then start to sort themselves out. And today's figures show, I believe, how important it is to both balance the books and continue reforming welfare.
Yes, Leslie.
Mr. Speaker, this morning's statistics show a depressing slowdown in the progress we should be making as a country towards the abolition of child poverty in the UK. Will the Secretary of State confirm that the numbers of children in absolute poverty have risen over his time in office? Will he confirm that last year 19% of children were in absolute poverty and that this year 19% of children are still in absolute poverty? And will he confirm that this year 17% of children were in relative poverty and that there are still 17% of children in relative poverty today? Has he dropped the ambition to end child poverty by 2020? This is not a time for complacency, Mr. Speaker. The Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission have warned that there is now no realistic hope of that target being met. So when the Prime Minister says he'll be judged on how we tackled poverty, what is their plan to catch up this lost ground here? Will the Secretary of State pause and reflect on the fact that nearly 1 in 5 children in this country are still growing up without some of the basics? And, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about the lives of children up and down this country, whether their parents can put money in the meter to keep their home warm in winter, whether they've got something or very little for their tea. The Child Poverty Act, which ministers supported, places one of the most important duties on a government to ensure that in the 21st century children do not grow up suffering deprivation or lacking the necessities that most of us take for granted. Yet progress has now slowed to a snail's pace. Wouldn't it be now shocking if the government now departs from the consensus that children should be free from such disadvantage by the end of this decade? So can I ask the Secretary of State to give a straight answer to the House today? Does he remain committed to the Child Poverty Act or not? Don't the government need a serious strategy to address low pay and boost productivity? They should be providing incentives for a living wage and new opportunities for high-quality skills as a more positive route out of poverty. But what does this Secretary of State do, faced with an end to progress in reducing child poverty? He threatens to cut £5 billion from the tax credits of children, which would mean 3.7 million working families losing on average £1,400 a year. That will not address child poverty, it will add to it. Does he realise that it's parents who are already working who will be hit by such a decision? How does it help to make work pay to have the rug pulled from underneath them in that way? Why is he trying to kid people into thinking that such a hit to incomes can be so easily replaced? Unless he's planning a rise by 25% in the minimum wage, that's not going to happen. Labour lifted over 1 million children out of relative poverty and over 2 million children out of absolute poverty, but under his watch, progress has now stalled. And is it really true, Mr. Speaker, that instead of developing policies to actually tackle low pay, this government, faced with statistics that show such poor progress, are going to try to erase the figure altogether, redefine the measure and pretend that the problem has just gone away? Is that statistical redefinition really something that he's now going to propose? The Conservative Party manifesto promised that they would, quote, work to eliminate child poverty and introduce better measures to drive real change. Well, Mr. Speaker, nobody realised that that meant they'd just change the measure. Instead of shifting the goalposts when things get uncomfortable, ministers should now take responsibility and tackle low pay, not attack the low paid.
Mr. Speaker, I think, honestly, the opposition today, and particularly the Right Honourable Member, has scored a massive own goal. You know, they tabled this urgent question before the statistics came out. So certain were they, and their friends on the left, that the statistics would show a massive rise. They were wrong, and they cannot accept that our reforms of welfare, which they never did in their time, are working. I remind him I am committed to the purpose to get people out of poverty and to end that process of families being in poverty. Most of what I've done in the last 10 years is dedicated to doing that. And the trouble with the Labour Party, and this is the real problem, is that they are wedded to this income measure, and their whole policy was skewed directly as a result of it. Our reforms have tackled the root causes of poverty. Employment is up over 2 million since 2010. I remember him saying that employment would fall directly as a result of our changes. The rate and level of children in workless households is at a record low. The number of households in social housing, the proportion in work, is at the highest level it has ever been since records began. And the rate and level of children in workless households is also at a record low. This is tackling the root causes of poverty. And the truth is, they have egg all over their face today. I find his comments really essentially close to rank hypocrisy, because they comprehensively failed themselves to meet their own targets, despite dumping huge sums of money into the welfare system, doing nothing to transform people's lives. Absolutely. They missed their own target to halve child poverty by 2010, and in-work poverty under the Labour government rose by 20%. And even though, Mr. Speaker, they ploughed money into the welfare system, welfare spending actually increased by 60% under the Labour government. And let me remind them how they did this. Tax credit spending rocketed in the years before each election. In 2003-04, it rose by 60%. In 2004-05, by 7.2%. And then, strangely, between the elections, it went flat. It even fell slightly. And then just before the 2010 election, it rose by 14.4% and then 8.5%. You know, the reality is, Mr. Speaker, we set out in our manifesto that we need to look at new measures of child poverty. Looking at life chances is the right way to do it, to get to the root causes of what is the reason why people get into poverty. And the current measures, I think, have led the last Labour government to a benefit system which gave families an extra £1 here or there just to push them above the poverty line, but did nothing to transform their lives. Let me give an example. A family that is officially in poverty under those measures, of parents that have huge drug problems, according to the measurement, they go over the line, they're not in poverty. But because they're likely to spend all their money on drugs, the children do not get fed. So the reality is they don't measure the life chances of that family, they measure only the income transfer. And at the beginning of the last Parliament, I started a debate about whether these measures are a sensible way of directing government efforts to changing people's lives. We undertook a consultation in 2012 and 2013 that received a wide range of responses with a broad consensus that the current measures did not recognise the range of actions needed to improve children's life chances. As a result, the government has a clear manifesto commitment on child poverty. We will work to eliminate child poverty and introduce better measures to drive real change in children's lives, getting to the root causes. And I believe we have a proud record in tackling that problem. We have raised the minimum wage faster and further than the last government did. It's focused on supporting families, improving educational attainment, supporting people into work, and allowing them to keep more of what they earn. Today's figures are a vindication, I believe, of our approach. And as the Right Honourable Member for Birkenhead, who I see sitting in his seat, said this morning, most of the electorate, they find the definition as exists of poverty, as defined by academics and politicians, to be utterly bewildering. I have always passionately believed in a welfare system focused on changing lives. Today shows not only have Labour lost the election, they've lost the argument. No wonder they're referred to as the Welfare Party.
Order! There's been a very considerable cacophony in the chamber. I can advise the House that at least 36 colleagues are seeking to catch my eye on this important matter, and I want to try to accommodate the level of interest, but we have business questions to follow and then a statement by the Secretary of State for Transport before we embark on a significantly subscribed debate following the Anderson report. So there is, frankly, a premium on brevity, both from backbenches and indeed from front. I hope that we can be given a tutorial in this matter by Sir Oliver Heald.
Can I start by congratulating my right honourable friend for the best figures in this particular area in his and my time in this House. But does he agree with me that it's sad to see Labour concentrating on statistics and benefits when the central insight that this government has had and which is working is that this area is all about work, education and tackling barriers to employment?
Can I say to my honourable friend, he's absolutely right. What we are determined to do is to bring life change to improve people's lives in the poorest communities. And the point I made about more households in social housing now in work than ever before, that is life change. They are taking control of their lives.
Mr. Frank Field.
I congratulate the Secretary of State on the PR success of winding up the media that these would be the worst figures published ever. But might that ingenuity now be actually applied to developing those indices on life chances? That what taxpayers are interested in is whether we can prevent poor children from becoming poor adults. Might he ask the Select Committee to undertake that inquiry, report to the House and then to his Social Justice Committee so the government might act on it before the year is out?
Can I just correct him on one small fact? I have not spent my time winding up the media. With respect, I think he needs to look at his front bench and some of their friends who have spent their whole time winding up the media. Can I just say to him, I welcome him in his new post, and he knows very well the door is open, so I'm very happy to sit down and discuss that proposition, but more importantly, what I believe should actually be in the measures.
Helen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Making sure work pays is vital to lifting families out of poverty. Can my right honourable friend agree with me that the effective rollout of universal credit is absolutely critical to achieving this goal of reducing poverty?
Yes, I say to my honourable friend, who I welcome to her place, that universal credit will reduce poverty because it makes every hour of work pay, and that means that going into work is no longer a tough decision, but it becomes an easy decision, and progressing into full-time work becomes much easier.
Mr. Iain Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a sad day for all of us when we come to this chamber and we hear that the Conservative government wish to redefine child poverty. It does take me back to what we faced under the Thatcher government at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, when they fiddled and changed the statistics and unemployment. History is repeating itself. We know from the Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland that have said that on the basis of the 12 billion of cuts that are to come between now and 2020, that an additional 100,000 children in Scotland are going to be pushed into poverty. That, Mr. Speaker, is an utter shameful disgrace that in a civilised society, in a wealthy country, that is happening today. I see from the figures that we have that are released today for Scotland that there are 210,000 children in Scotland living in relative poverty after housing costs. 22% of children in the country of Scotland. After housing costs, 140,000 children are living in combined low income and material deprivation, a 20,000 increase over the course of the last year. That's the reality of what the economic agenda of the last government has done to Scotland, and we know there's more to come if the honourable gentleman and his government gets his way. Because of the impact of the government's policy in Scotland...
Order. Let me just explain, for the benefit of the House, because some people don't have long enough memories, that when the Liberal Democrats were the third party, in respect of urgent questions, they did get an allocation of time comparable to that of the person who tabled the question. So, of course, the honourable gentleman will wish to try to preserve the attention of the House, but the honourable gentleman is enjoying the entitlement only that was previously accorded to third parties, and I hope he will therefore be accorded appropriate courtesy. Mr. Iain Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, the Scottish Government are having to intervene and have funded poverty action campaigns in Scotland by an additional £300 million against the bedroom tax and other measures to try and alleviate some of the problems that this government are causing for our people. Isn't it a disgrace that in my own constituency, as an example, the biggest increase in attention that the food banks, of use at the food banks, is coming from those in work? That's the reality of this government's policies, and that's why in the election campaign, the Scottish National Party campaigned on an issue of the £2 increase in the minimum wage over the lifetime of this Parliament and the adoption of the living wage. It is unacceptable that anyone in this country should be living in poverty. Far too many families in Scotland and throughout the UK are having to make choices of whether to heat their home or feed their children. That is morally unacceptable. We believe that the best way of dealing with poverty is to have an integration of tax and benefits that leads to a real ladder that takes people out of poverty, not the stigmatisation that we're seeing from this government that punishes the poor in our society. I ask...
Order. When I'm on my feet, the honourable gentleman resumes his seat. That's the situation. I'm trying to be helpful, the honourable gentleman. I fear that subtlety didn't quite work with the honourable gentleman. And when I see a process of constant page-turning, that is a source of anxiety to the chair. And I simply say to the honourable gentleman that the thrust of the matter has to be a series of questions, and once we get beyond that and to a series of comments or rhetorical questions, I feel that the honourable gentleman, in the interests of the House and in the interests of himself, can appropriately resume his seat, and we're grateful to him. We're very grateful to him.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I had been looking at those sheets of paper. I assumed there was a bit more to come. Can I say to the honourable gentleman, welcome him to his post and his position. I do agree that there is always more to be done. We want to eradicate poverty and child poverty. But I think the figures show that we've made good progress, but I'm not complacent. I also say to him that the Scottish nationalists have campaigned, obviously, for independence, but they have many of the levers in their hands. And if he complains about poverty and child poverty in Scotland, my question really is to what degree have the Scottish government acted actually to make some of the changes that he wants? He gave a couple of points, but the point I would make to him is that employment in Scotland, given the situation, is at a kind of record high, and that has not been the case in past after recession. So the work we've done to get people back into work, workless households, households who were once who are in social housing, that is a huge success, and it's worth reminding him that across the board in the UK, some 800,000 fewer people are in relative low income before housing costs, and 300,000 fewer children are in relative low income. And the one point that he does make, which talks about a benefit system reformed so that it has a connection with the tax system, I tell him that universal credit is exactly what he is hoping for, and so far we've had a bit of resistance from his government. I hope now he'll go back and say, let's go for this full time.
Fiona Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree that working to support families to prevent family breakdown is critical to improve children's life chances, especially as family breakdown hits the poorest hardest? And would he also agree that Labour singularly failed to address this when they were in government?
I say to my honourable friend, who is a doughty campaigner for families and for assisting families to stay together, that many of the reforms that we've made are actually helping families stay together. Our reforms now to the Child Maintenance and Enforcement Commission, Child Support Agency was often known in the past, hugely offers families the chance to actually sort their problems out before they go through the system, and we're now seeing record numbers of those actually making their own balanced arrangements. We've put extra money, millions, into counselling for families on the verge of breakup, and we believe that is helping them as well, and the Troubled Families programme is aimed at stabilising families.
Karen Buck.
Poverty in inner London after housing costs is the highest in the country at a scandalous 33%. Does the Secretary of State share my disappointment that, whilst we all believe that work should pay and is the best route out of poverty for many, that the numbers on low pay in London has actually risen for the fourth year in a row, that there are 1/3 more Londoners in low pay than was the case in 2010? And can he reassure me that the way to tackle low pay is not to cut tax credits?
What actually the figures do show, and I agree, London and parts of London, as a London MP, have particular and deep-rooted problems. And what we therefore want to do is to address those particular problems and at the same time ensure that when people go back into work, first of all, it is true that they're better off in work than they would be out of work because they have no chance of raising their income. But we also want companies, and I made this clear on Monday, to actually start paying people a proper wage. I have campaigned endlessly to raise the minimum wage. We've raised it. The government is committed to raising it further, and I've said to companies it's time now that you pay more money to your employees to rate them as they should be for the work that they've done.
Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree that the target-based culture of the left actually encourages dependency and makes people stay in poverty because that's the right incentive for them, and that his policies are offering a new opportunity that is transforming people's lives, and he deserves the full support of the House and the country?
Can I thank my honourable friend? The point he makes is absolutely critical. If you set up a target process that only deals with one aspect of what a symptom is, you don't get to the root causes. What we've actually set out to do is to get to those families the furthest away from employment and move them into independence through employment. And the figures I've given over the numbers of people in social housing now back in work and those on lowest income is dramatic, as they are better than any other records previously established.
This is Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has been in his post for 5 years. In that time, the number of households living in absolute poverty has gone up by 2 million, and the number of children has gone up by 500,000. So isn't ditching the relative poverty measure and moving to focus on absolute poverty a complete own goal?
Very good question.
Can I just remind the Honourable Lady of the statistics? There are 800,000 fewer people in relative low income, 300,000 fewer children in relative low income, 100,000 fewer pensioners in relative low income, 670,000 fewer workless households, and 390,000 fewer children living in workless households. These are the real statistics, and my point to her is it's far better for us to look at the real life chances of families that they left behind, trapped in poverty because they could not change their lives. We are changing them.
Oliver Dowden.
Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the single best way out of poverty is to have a job, and would he therefore welcome the fact that the number of children in workless households is at a record low under this government?
Yes, can I welcome my honourable friend to his place, and can I just agree with him and just give him one statistic, that the rate and level record lows of workless households is down over 670,000 since 2010, and there are 50,000 fewer households where nobody has ever worked. These were people left behind by the Labour government.
Kirsty Blackman.
To agree with me that within the limited powers the Scottish Government has, Scottish children cannot be protected from the extreme breadth and extent of the attacks on the welfare system from successive Conservative governments.
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady again, I welcome her to her position. She can't have it both ways. The Scottish Government can't at one and the same time have demanded and got extra powers, both through taxation, etc., and then turn round and say it's not our fault that we can't change anything in Scotland. If you want those powers, you cannot come to the House of Commons and complain because you can't change anything in Scotland.
Craig Whittaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is good news that poverty levels are at the lowest level since the mid-1980s, showing work actually does pay. But would my right honourable friend agree with me that the current measure for poverty is out of date and we need a measure which highlights the root causes of poverty?
As the House will know, we started that debate back in 2011. We had a full consultation not long before the last election, and I have taken the view for some time that we need a better way of measuring what happens to families trapped at the lowest levels of income who don't seem to be able to change their lives. These measures at the moment don't really measure that properly and don't give you any indication of how you can resolve that. Life change is the key. We need to measure how we do that.
Mr. David Hanson.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear in Wales that unemployment has fallen, but at the same time, 1/3 of the children in Wales live in absolute poverty, 200,000 children. So would the Secretary of State tell me what plans he has to tackle zero-hour contracts, insecurity at work, low pay, and does he think the cuts in child tax credit are going to help that situation dramatically?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that Wales has, he knows, historically had some deep-rooted problems in the way that their communities, etc., have often found themselves literally physically distanced from some of the developments in parts of the rest of Wales. We are working hard to ensure through transport links that people can get to work quicker, they can travel further distances, they can get those jobs. It's also important to recognise that, as he said, employment in Wales has improved, which was not the case previously, and we are working hard. And I'm very happy to talk to him about any specific issues and details about Wales. I am determined to help Wales improve even more than they have done.
Great, Tracey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that ensuring that all children have a high-quality education and the opportunity to learn vital skills is critical to ensuring those growing up in low-income households can escape welfare dependency and go on to a well-paid job?
I do, indeed I do. And I say to my honourable friend, who I again welcome to his place, that what he says is exactly right. We must work harder to ensure that those families with the deep-rooted and deep-seated problems are turned around and got back into work so they are independent of what government does.
Caroline Lucas.
When he received the confidential government assessment marked sensitive, which warned him that reducing the benefit cap could plunge up to 40,000 more children into poverty, did he stop to think about the consequences, or is he sticking to his insulting idea that people want to be on benefits despite the reality that most people want to work but the decently paid work they need simply isn't there?
Can I say to the Honourable Lady, I have never believed that people want to be on benefits. I actually believe the vast, vast majority of people who are on benefits want to be doing something about that and change their lives. Everything I am doing is to try and do that. Every policy we're doing is to get the economy right and to help people get back into work.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State is right to stress that child poverty is not just a problem of income, that many families on low income often need support to make them work ready with mental health problems, and we still have many tens of thousands of children in this country with attachment problems. So whilst rightly mentioning the success of the Troubled Families Programme, does he agree that what we also need is a pre-Troubled Families Programme to tackle inherited problems at source, often around attachment disorder?
Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, I recognise the huge work that he has personally done aimed at trying to transform the lives of the most troubled families, and I pay tribute to him for it and the way he continues to do it. I say to him that the Troubled Families Programme was a success, but we're now extending that, and within that extension I think there is scope to do exactly what he wants to do.
Mr. Barry Sherman.
Would the Secretary of State agree that all of us who want every child in our country to have a full and happy life do get worried, not just about the debate we're having this morning, but the fact that responsibility for children is spread over so many departments, there is no longer enough focus on children in a holistic sense? And could he lead the government in doing something about that quite quickly?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that he's right? I often find myself in agreement with him. What I am now tasked with doing is chairing a cabinet committee called the Social Justice Cabinet Committee, the purpose of which is to bring together all of the aspects of work on families and children and try and make sure we have a concerted and single approach to that. But he's absolutely right, that's half the problem in government.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that today's statistics showing the percentage of children in relative low income is at its lowest level since the 1980s, and is proof that this government's policy is working not just in this area, but social justice as a whole?
I believe that is the case. There is hugely more to do. I don't for one moment stand here today and say, you know, somehow it's all brilliantly successful. Quite the contrary. This is a very difficult area, but we're dealing with some of the most troubled and the most difficult families, trying to turn them around. So he's right, but we have more to do, and that is the purpose of why I am here.
Mr. David Winnick.
If a situation has improved substantially, according to the Secretary of State, why has there been such a large amount of food banks, far larger than previously? And isn't it quite clear that some Tory members have no idea at all of the amount of poverty which exists in many cases in their own constituencies?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman I don't agree with him. I think most of my colleagues have hugely involved with food banks and actually help them. And I welcome food banks. I welcome decent people in society trying to help others who may, for various reasons, have fallen into difficulty. I don't accept that the single cause of that is to do with the welfare reforms. Quite the contrary. What I actually say to the honourable gentleman is food bank usage has been rising over a period. It was never part of the British system, but in Germany, where their welfare payments, you can argue, are higher, 1.5 million people a week use food banks, much more than they do here.
Mr. Nigel Mills.
I welcome the Secretary of State's commitment to tackling the root causes of poverty, but one of the big issues for low-income families is the level of debt they already have. What more can the government do to help families who find themselves in that situation?
Yeah, problem debt is hugely an issue, and the thing that we're doing with universal credit through universal services delivered locally is working with local authorities. So if people have a debt problem, we will continue to pay their rent, but we will insist that working with the council they are put on debt programmes to help them manage their money so they can become independent, because if they're in debt they will not sustain themselves through work, and that is the key thing to change. He's right.
Conor McGinn.
Speaker, child poverty in St Helens is higher than the national average. Does the right honourable gentleman think that taking in-work benefits away from working families would increase or decrease the levels of child poverty in my constituency?
Well, our purpose is to support people as they go into work and progress into full-time work. That's what universal credit is all about. And I believe what he will see as we complete the rollout of this, actually more families will benefit, and the result is that actually they will benefit to the degree of taking their own lives in their own hands and having that independence of a pay packet.
Paul Maynard.
Does the Secretary of State share my desire to focus on those children in persistent poverty, i.e. 3 years out of 4, many of whom sadly are in my constituency and face multiple disadvantages within their family? Does it not agree that they were a specific group wholly ignored by the last Labour government's anti-poverty strategy?
I say to my honourable friend, who has really campaigned hard on this, he's right. And one of the problems, if you set a narrow measure like this and then you're governed by it, is it's all about rotating people at the top of the relative poverty, not actually dealing with the deepest and deep-set problems. And that is what our purpose must be as we go forward to look at new measures.
On break.
Speaker, blue-collar conservatism didn't last long. Instead of hitting hard-working families with billions of pounds worth of cuts, driving up child poverty, why doesn't the Secretary of State instead shift the burden of deficit reduction to the very wealthy and implement sound Liberal Democrat policies like extending free school meals and childcare?
I welcome the honourable gentleman to his position, and I simply remind him that for 5 years he was part of what we were doing, so I would hope that he would welcome today. I'm sure that there is a new set of policies, and I'm very happy to look at what he's come up with.
Mr Peter Bone.
Mr Speaker, before the Secretary of State was in his post, in my constituency surgeries, there was a benefit culture. People came into my surgery, none of the family had ever worked. Gradually over time that has shifted now, with more and more people getting jobs. And isn't that the root success story? If we can get people into work, we break the benefit culture.
Can I say to my old friend, this is exactly the point. It is work that takes people out of poverty. For those who are furthest away and have the greatest difficulty, we must support them. But the rest of them, we want them to move into work, to remove the barriers, the debt problems and all those issues, and get them into work, get their education of their kids better and improve their life chances. He's spot on.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I feel this increased child benefit and child tax credit in line with the cost of living means that more than 1 in 5 families struggle to provide the basics for their children. Given this unacceptable situation, does he support the End Child Poverty campaign, which calls on the government to give children's benefits the same triple lock protection as a state pension?
I welcome the honourable gentleman to his post, and can I say that the latest figures from Scotland show that there has been a fall of 40,000 in relative poverty between 2012-13 and 13-14. So our position is to help the worst off, to support pensioners through the triple lock and get all of them into a sustained life of good income.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This week I attended the launch of Scope's Extra Costs Commission, looking at the barriers for disabled people entering the workplace. Can I urge the Right Honourable Gentleman to do all he can to continue the strategy of the government to ensure that more disabled people are able to enter the workplace?
My honourable friend, who I welcome, he makes a very powerful point. It is worth reminding, through our programme of Disability Confident and the support we're putting now to get more people with disabilities back into work, that there are now more people with disabilities in work than ever before. That's not good enough. It's still too far below the line of those in work elsewhere, and we want to halve that gap by the end of this Parliament.
Jonathan Reynolds.
The Secretary of State can use any definition he likes. The root cause of child poverty in my area is the fact that a quarter of all the full-time jobs pay less than the living wage. What is this government's strategy for low pay and in-work poverty?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, one of the greatest causes of difficulty for those families would have been the economy crashing and people losing their jobs. And our position, in answer to his question, is that it is my government that has raised the minimum wage faster and higher. Is it high enough? No. We are committed to raising it again in October, and we want to drive it further up. And I've made it very clear myself that I want employers to actually look to be paying that living wage, as the Prime Minister has said, and he'll have to watch this space.
Dr. Tania Mathias.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my honourable friend agree that poverty, we want to eradicate poverty, and I even have it in my constituency in Twickenham. I've seen poverty in different parts of the world. I have not seen the isolation of families who are relatively poor in my area of Twickenham. May I applaud the plans and the continuing plans for free childcare for 2-year-olds. That is where I have seen part of the eradication of poverty, is families coming together and being part of the community in Twickenham.
Can I say to my honourable friend, I welcome her, particularly to her post. And although people were making noise opposite, they should recognise her backstory is remarkable in the work that she has done to help communities and families in the past. So I welcome her here, and I also say that she's absolutely right. Getting to those families who have educational difficulties, who are isolated from the community, back into a community, supported and helped to get back into work is absolutely the key, and she's right on the money.
Diana Johnson.
Speaker, with 48% of children in Orchard Park and Greenwood Ward in my constituency living in poverty, does the Secretary of State think removing the in-work benefits will increase that number or reduce that number?
The best thing that we can do for those families is the support programmes that I've talked about, helping those families get a better education, helping those families be more stable, and helping them get into work. I will say to her that being in work and progressing in work is the greatest solution to poverty in her area as it is in mine.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, one of the triumphs of the coalition government was the Troubled Families Initiative, which concentrated resources on the most needy. Could my right honourable friend just describe the impact there has been on the child poverty aspects of those families that have been assisted?
Can I say to my honourable friend that the impact has been enormous. We actually dealt with 120,000 families and more than 105,000 of those families that we were after against all the target measures, including in-work, educational attainment, actually had their lives turned around by February 2015. We are going to extend that programme to incorporate more troubled families.
Esterson.
For the avoidance of doubt, I'd like to ask the Secretary of State a question about people already in work. So can he tell me, will cutting tax credits for people in work, will it help or harm the poorest children?
My view is quite simply that we need to support people in work to make sure that they both have the support that's necessary and they progress into work. And actually, I make a very simple point, which I've said already before in this House, that it is also the responsibility of companies that employ people to pay them a decent wage, not rely solely on government to top up those incomes. We are and have backed those families. We will continue to back those families, and universal credit will make that even more relevant and a greater level of support.
Tom Pursglove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What impact is the government's policy of taking low-income families out of tax altogether having? And how many families directly benefit from that approach?
Can I say to my honourable friend, we've taken millions out of tax altogether, which has improved their incomes dramatically, and I think something like 25 million have actually seen their tax bill reduced directly. So for those who have a limited amount of income, this is a huge change and a huge support, and not ever recognised by the other side, who basically raised their taxes rather than lowered them.
Kelvin Hopkins.
Speaker, the Secretary of State will have read, no doubt, the book The Spirit Level, which has shown that social ills correlate strongly with income inequality. Crime, mental illness, infant mortality, and much more besides. At the worst end, we have the USA, and at the best end, the Scandinavian countries. These social ills cost billions to the public purse. We continue to languish close to the USA end rather than the Scandinavian end. Doesn't all this make a powerful case for dramatically reducing income inequality and thus reducing child poverty?
Yeah, can I say I agree with the honourable gentleman, and the purpose is to get income inequality down. Income inequality actually fell over the last Parliament, but actually the way to do that is to improve the numbers going into work and to get them further and into full-time work. Universal credit helps that enormously, but I agree with him.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to invite the Secretary of State to come to Taunton, to Halcon, and there you will see how the government's long-term strategy to address the root causes of poverty is actually working. This is in the 4% most deprived parts of the country. It has 4 generations of unemployed families living. The One Team project with police and education and everyone working together is actually working, and I urge you to come and have a look.
Can I say to my honourable friend, welcome her, but also say absolutely it wouldn't take me much to get out to go to Taunton. With my right honourable friend sitting next to me, I hope he'll be tolerant when she asks me and I ask for a slip.
Order, I'm going to try to accommodate the remaining interested colleagues, but they do need to be extremely brief, and I know the Secretary of State will follow suit. Where's Streeting?
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will supply benches if he's a champion for a higher minimum wage and for employers to pay the living wage. But isn't it the case that to get every employer to pay the living wage will take considerable time, whereas his government is looking to cut tax credits for people who are in work and on poverty pay overnight?
Well, it's interesting that the honourable gentleman says that, because I do genuinely believe, and I'm engaged in that process, of expecting British employers to actually pay a decent wage to people they employ. And that is, I don't think actually he's right. I think it will take a much shorter time to get employers to face up to their responsibilities. But as he's offered his support, I'm very happy to talk about it.
Andrew Stevenson.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State for taking time to visit Nelson Job Centre with me? In Pendle, we have some fantastic local organisations, such as branches of Christians Against Poverty, the Local Citizens Advice Bureau, Colne Open Door, and many others running job clubs. Could he say more about what his department is doing to work with such organisations and charities to help families out of poverty?
Job centres have been tasked. They've been given the freedom of the flexible support fund, so they have money to help support some of these organisations. And also one of the areas that we now do a lot of work with is with debt counselling, and we use debt counsellors, local ones and also others on a national scale.
Diane Abbott.
London has some of the highest levels of child poverty in the country. Given that his welfare cuts will bear particularly harshly on working Londoners because of our high housing costs, why isn't he at least calling for the implementation of a London living wage?
Well, actually, I have done, and in my own department, I insisted that the contractors paid a London living wage. The Department of Work and Pensions pays a London living wage, and all the contractors do. And we showed that actually they didn't lose any jobs. They improved efficiency. People were happier. They did a better job. So I agree with her. I am determined that others should learn from that and recognise you need to pay people a decent wage for the job that they do.
Chris Skidmore. Speaker.
In Kingswood, unemployment is down from 1,320 in May 2010 to 609 today, a fall of 54%. Does my honourable friend welcome this and agree with me that the most important action that can be taken to reduce child poverty is to reduce long-term unemployment, ultimately ending long-term welfare dependency?
I agree with my honourable friend. Long-term unemployment is falling. We're getting to the root causes of the problem, and that will continue, and that is the key to actually helping people out of poverty.
Mary McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the approaching long school summer holidays, it's a particularly difficult time for children living in food poverty because they don't have access to free school meals or breakfast clubs. What is his department planning to do to tackle that issue?
Well, that's not directly in my department. I'm very happy, though, if the honourable lady wants to come and see me about that, talk about any specific issues and problems, to talk to her about, through my Social Justice Cabinet Committee, we can actually drive to ensure that the balance and support is there available for those who need it.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State for his earlier answer to my honourable friend from Paisley and Renfrewshire North, in which he perhaps unintentionally highlighted some of the success the Scottish Government have had in using their limited powers to mitigate the worst impacts of his government's cuts. But would the Secretary of State not agree that the Government could immediately stop making child poverty worse by announcing an immediate end to any benefit sanction against families with young children?
Actually, it's improving, but I will say to him, I heard the last bit was slightly lost, but I heard the sanctions was the issue he was raising, I think, in that particular point. families with children. My point about this is that, remember, that although if we do sanction somebody, and I have to tell him the processes are exhaustive before that happens, yes they are, the reality, however, oh yes they are, can I just say to the honourable gentleman that they continue to be supported through all of the child support mechanisms, including child benefit and the household support that's there as well.
Ruth Smeeth.
In my constituency, thank you, Mr. Speaker, in my constituency, 31% of my children are born into poverty. That's over 6,000 children, and 36% earn less than the living wage of their parents. I've already had people arrive in tears, people who are working at my surgeries, terrified about what's going to happen when you cut tax credit. What would you like me to tell to my constituents?
Well, I should tell them that they should wait, as you should do, to see what we bring forward. She may be surprised.
Steve McCabe.
Has the Secretary of State considered calls for the establishment of a Child Poverty and Prevention Board or Council, as happens elsewhere, so that we can focus all our energies on the things that really make a difference, rather than risk getting trapped in a sterile debate about how we measure rather than reduce poverty?
Well, I'm interested by that question that the honourable gentleman raises. I agree that it is important to get beyond this sterile debate. I want to bring forward to the House what I consider to be the right kind of measures, and then I'm very happy to discuss options. The right honourable member for Birkenhead has come up with an idea. I'm happy to discuss that as well with the honourable gentleman.
The Abrahams.
I have to say I found the tone of the Secretary of State absolutely breathtaking. But once again, given that 2/3 of children living in poverty are from working families, could he for the 6th time answer the question, what assessment has his government undertaken to the proposed cuts in tax credits and how that will affect child poverty levels?
I say to the honourable lady that we have got more people back into work, more people progressing through work, more people are better off. They're better off in work than they are out of work, a factor that she seems to miss completely with that. And the tax changes and the reductions in their takeaway means that they are actually better off. The answer to her question is very simple. We will continue to support people who need that support through into work and beyond. That is the purpose of universal credit. She should stand assured by that.
Kate Green.
Today's Household Below Average Income report on page 45 makes quite clear that the percentage of children in relative income poverty has been flatlining since 2011-12. So it's not the policies of either this or the previous coalition government that have reduced poverty, it's the legacy of the last Labour government. Would the Secretary of State agree?
OK, that's an interesting argument. I simply say to the honourable lady, if she wants to claim that, then she can also claim the disaster of the crashed economy that the Labour Party delivered, putting millions of people out of work.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, following his Damascene conversion on the road to a Glasgow housing estate, the Secretary of State pledged there would be no going back on Labour's target to end child poverty. With nearly 9,000 children in poverty in Erdington, the great majority in working households, what does he have to say to the working mums I met in the Erdington food bank in despair at what now looms for them at the next stages? To use the grotesque words of the Chancellor, these are strivers, not shirkers, but his government is about to make them and their children poorer.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I hope he also tells them that under his government they failed to halve child poverty against their target. So, you know, before we get a lecture about child poverty from that lot over there, what I simply say to them, their economic mess, crashing the economy and putting millions out of work, did more damage to his constituents than anything else. We're here to help them and get them back into work.